In the oldest archives of Briar Ridge County, there was a marginal note written in faded ink that simply read, "The lights should not have been on that night." It is from this phrase, fragile, forgotten, and surrounded by silence, that this story begins to be reconstructed. Before we continue, the researcher who narrates these records leaves a simple request for the viewer. Comment on which city you are watching from and what time it is there at this moment. Small details like this always help to understand where those who listen to stories like this come from. The Briar Ridge Orphanage, founded in 1887, stood isolated among damp hills and strips of forest that the winter wind made creak like old wood. It was an austere three-story building with narrow windows and a children's dormitory that occupied the entire top floor. There, 41 children lived under strict rules, meticulous routines, and a silent order that was believed necessary to build character. The surrounding community was small, consisting of farmers, loggers, and merchants, who rarely approached the school except to deliver supplies. For many, the institution was a practical solution for children whom life had left without families. For others, it was too harsh a place for such young beings. Records show both sides. Praise for the disciplined effort and veiled criticism of the cold, controlled environment. In August 1901, a new teacher arrived at the school. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, from Providence, just over 28 years old, prepared to teach reading and history to the younger children. Her letters, preserved in the state archives, describe her arrival with a mixture of enthusiasm and strangeness. She spoke of the constant smell of damp wood, the curtains always closed in the dormitory, and the way some children avoided looking directly at adults, as if each gesture had been carefully rehearsed. Eleanor was not an impressionable woman. She had previously worked in educational institutions for children from working-class families, knew the harshness of everyday life, and understood that many children adopted quiet behavior as a reaction to adversity. Even so, something about the environment at Briar Ridge seemed too restrained. According to her descriptions, even laughter seemed measured, half-swallowed, and ceased too quickly when an employee approached. The routine began early. At 5:30 in the morning, the bells rang, and the small group filed down to the dining hall. Eleanor watched everything closely. The way the older boys sat apart, how the 9 to 11-year-old girls exchanged notes whenever they could, and how 3 of the younger children, Benjamin, Thomas, and Clara, seemed burdened with a weariness that did not match their age. The documents indicate that she tried to report this to the principal, Mr. Hargrove, who replied curtly that adjustment takes time. The following weeks revealed a little more about the school from the teacher's careful perspective. She described the dormitory as a long hall, lit by tall windows that rarely let in the sun, and that at night, even with so many children sleeping, the atmosphere seemed strangely still, as if holding its breath. These observations, however, were never formally considered by the administration. They are only recorded today as notes attached to her diaries. But there was another detail, recorded by Eleanor and confirmed by 2 employees: the dormitory lights. According to their reports, every night, strictly at 9 o'clock, the lamps were turned off by an employee named Merritt Hollow. However, 3 days before the disappearance, Eleanor claimed to have seen a strip of light escaping through the half-closed dormitory door after 9:15 p.m. from the hallway. She thought Merritt was making some late adjustments, but when she mentioned it the next morning, he claimed he had not returned to the 3rd floor after his usual time. She insisted she had seen the light. He stated again that he had not been there. The administration attributed the discrepancy to the fatigue of the newly arrived teacher. However, her notes from that night tell a different story. It wasn't just the light. It was the movement of shadows, as if someone were walking between the rows of beds. No official record mentions these shadows, only the teacher's words. Still, the oldest document on the investigation, preserved with the county sheriff's seal, succinctly notes that, in the week of the event, there were inaccurate reports of lights after hours and unconfirmed movement on the upper floor. And this is where the mystery begins to close in on the school. For when cross-referencing letters, testimonies, and reports, it becomes clear that everything converges on the same night, the same window of hours, the same silent floor. And in the last paragraph of the letter Eleanor wrote the day before her disappearance, there is a sentence that historians are still trying to interpret. The children seem to be waiting for something. I can't say what, but I feel that we are all on the verge of a change that no one asked for. It is this sentence, written less than 24 hours before the event, that closes this first block and opens the door to a question that still echoes today among the archives. What, exactly, were the children of Briar Ridge waiting for? Preserved records from the Briar Ridge Orphan School show that, before their disappearance, the routine of the 41 children followed an almost military pattern. Discipline was the central axis of the institution: strict schedules, counted meals, silent study, and manual activities that varied according to age. The researcher who narrates this reconstruction identifies, in the documents, a constant attempt to transform the chaos of these children's lost lives into predictable order. But when looking at the notes of teacher Eleanor Hartwell, one realizes that there was something behind this order, something that did not quite fit. When Eleanor arrived, she described the children as better behaved than expected, and quiet in a way that seems trained, unnatural. She noticed that almost no children ran in the hallways, that conversations were brief, and that laughter, when it did occur, was restrained, as if there were an unwritten rule that everyone knew but was not written in any manual. According to her diaries, the silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a presence. The employees who had worked there the longest, the cook, Mrs. Mulligan, the janitor, Merritt Hollow, and 2 teaching assistants, rarely talked to Eleanor about the institution's past. They simply said that things had been that way for a long time, and that children learn quickly what they need to learn. There was no explicit hostility, just a kind of cautious reserve, as if explaining too much would break a tacit agreement. In the dining hall, the children lined up in exact rows, always in the same positions. Eleanor tried to change some of these arrangements for pedagogical reasons, but the children reacted with deep discomfort. Some were paralyzed by the change. Others, especially the younger ones, seemed apprehensive, almost to the point of tears. The teacher noted, "I don't understand why simply changing places causes so much fear. It's as if occupying the wrong place could have consequences." Eleanor's relationship with 3 specific children, Benjamin, Thomas, and Clara, began to draw attention in the documents. They appear repeatedly in her notes, not because of misbehavior, but because of expressions that did not match their age. Eleanor describes Benjamin as an 8-year-old boy who looked out the window as if waiting for someone to appear on the road. Thomas, 7, often raised his head in the early hours of the morning, as if he heard something. And Clara, 9, had a habit of hiding small objects under her pillow: buttons, pieces of fabric, a fragment of wood. When Eleanor asked her why, the girl simply replied, "So I won't forget." This not forgetting intrigued the teacher. In the students' admission reports, there was no information that would justify such specific behavior, but oral accounts from former employees, collected decades later, claim that some children were transferred to Briar Ridge without much documentation, especially after periods of illness, fires, or displacements of entire families that left fragmented records. The school took in whatever came its way, and did what it could to reorder the lives of these little ones. Still, there was something deeper. Eleanor noticed, for example, that at recess the children rarely spread out across the playground. They preferred to stay close to each other, walking in small groups that seemed chosen by affinity, but which, in fact, obeyed a silent logic that the teacher could not decipher. "Sometimes," she wrote, "it seems that the groups form not out of friendship, but out of vigilance." The teacher's letters to her sister, sent in early September, reveal a growing tone of unease. She described nights when she woke up with the feeling that the hallway was brighter than it should be. Other times, she said she heard footsteps coming from the 3rd floor, when, theoretically, all the children should have been asleep, and no staff members were supposed to go upstairs after 9 p.m. In her words, "The sounds are light but constant. They are not children running around. They are like careful movements." The school administration kept extensive records, performance reports, activity lists, supply inventories. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that explained the strangeness of the nighttime routine described by Eleanor. It is as if the life of the school were completely transparent during the day and almost opaque or distorted at night. The researcher reviewing these documents highlights a particularly significant episode, a writing activity that Eleanor used to assess the children's writing. The theme was simple: describe something you would like to see in the future. Most wrote about everyday objects, better clothes, a special meal, learning to play an instrument. But 4 of the children wrote sentences that were too similar to be a coincidence. I would like the room to be really quiet. I would like to sleep without waiting. I would like the door to stay closed all night. I would like no one to have to get up. The teacher was deeply disturbed by these texts. According to her letters, she tried to talk to each of the authors individually, but none of them wanted to explain what the sentences meant. They all simply said that it was just imagination, but their looks, as described, carried a weight that children of that age rarely show. The routine continued, but the atmosphere of growing tension became more evident in the teacher's descriptions. There are reports that in some late afternoons, the children watched the woods behind the school with unusual attention, as if they saw something they never mentioned to the authorities or staff. It is at times like these, Eleanor wrote, that I feel I am outside of something that everyone else seems to understand. It was in this silent environment, filled with small signs and unspoken concerns, that the backdrop for the last week before the disappearance was formed, a week recorded in enough detail to realize that something was about to break the rigid structure of the institution. And at the end of this second part of the story, the documents reveal a discreet but deeply symbolic event. 3 days before the disappearance, 9 children refused to sleep in the traditional bunk beds and dragged their mattresses close to the door, claiming that it was safer there. No staff member was able to convince them to return to their beds that night. And according to the records, it would be the last night they would all be seen alive. The official records of the disappearance of the 41 children from Briar Ridge were first compiled in 1902, months after the event, when the emotional climate was still too dense to allow for a completely objective account. Even so, it is possible to reconstruct with considerable accuracy the last night the school functioned as an institution, and that reconstruction begins with what Eleanor Hartwell described as the sudden change in the air, something she noticed on September 16th. According to her diaries, the children had been unusually restless since dawn. During reading class, 3 of them dropped their books at the same time for no apparent reason. In calligraphy class, there were so many mistakes that Eleanor postponed the activity. Realizing that the tension seemed collective, she tried to calm them down with a story, but their eyes remained scattered, wandering to the window or the dark corner of the room. They were counting the time, she wrote, silently but counting. At the end of the afternoon, she found Clara, the girl with the small objects kept under her pillow, sitting in the hallway, staring at the door leading to the 3rd floor. When asked why she wasn't at recess, Clara simply replied, "He said he won't be long." Eleanor asked who he was, but the girl remained silent, closing her eyes as if she had said more than she should have. This passage appears in several later testimonies, but none of the children who survived the trauma, the few who were found in the following months, scattered across distant regions, ever confirmed the meaning of the phrase. Early evening arrived faster than usual. A fog rose from the valley and swallowed the school's facade, turning the windows into mere rectangular shadows amid the grey. The cook, Mrs. Mulligan, reported feeling a heavy calm, like before a storm, although no rain was forecast. At 8:55 p.m., Merritt Hollow climbed the stairs as he did every day to turn off the dormitory lights. He would be the last adult to see the 41 children gathered together. The caretaker's reports, revisited years later, described the dormitory that night as strangely organized. Instead of the beds being lined up, some children had dragged mattresses close to the windows. Others lay on the floor, close to the walls. This was against all the rules of the institution. Merritt tried to reprimand them, but encountered silent resistance. No child responded. No one reacted emotionally. It was as if they had decided something among themselves. Not even he could have imagined that this would be the last intact scene of that children's community. When Eleanor went up to the third floor about 10 minutes later, something she rarely did after curfew, she found the hallway lit by a light that, according to her, did not come from the lanterns, but seemed to be reflected. This description, of course, sparked controversy later on, not because it suggested something supernatural, but because no lit lanterns were found there when the authorities arrived. According to historians, it is likely that Eleanor saw only the mixture of fog and internal light escaping from a poorly closed door. She describes hearing light footsteps behind the dormitory door. Not running footsteps, but slow footsteps, as if someone were carefully crossing the rows of beds so as not to wake anyone. The teacher thought it was Merritt finishing some adjustment. However, when she knocked on the door and called him, no sound answered. When she opened the door, she found the hall empty, at least empty of visible movement. The beds were partially misaligned, some with blankets folded on the floor. The east window was ajar, letting in cold air and causing the curtains to vibrate with a noise similar to a long breath. Eleanor noted, "I felt as if I had arrived too late." The first minutes of the disappearance are shrouded in gaps and fragments of contradictory accounts. What is known is that between 9 and 10 o'clock that night, all 41 children left the dormitory without attracting the attention of any adults. There are no records of broken doors or mass escape through the windows. The school had only two possible exits: the large front door, which was found closed with the lock intact, and the back door, which led to the woods, and according to the caretaker, always creaked. That night, however, no one heard the creaking. One of the pieces of evidence most discussed by researchers is a page from Eleanor's diary, written hastily in shaky handwriting. In it, she describes seeing long shadows crossing the lawn toward the woods, in a line, as if obeying a command I couldn't hear. The shadows, according to her, were numerous and small, consistent with children. But the most disturbing and realistic detail is that none of them were running. They walked slowly, in line, as if following a familiar routine. As she descended the stairs in search of help, Eleanor found Merritt in the second-floor hallway, pale, claiming he had heard footsteps behind him, but found no one. The two ran to the back door and found it only ajar, not open, not broken, just ajar. Fog covered the courtyard like a thick sheet. As they leaned out, they saw no children, only faint marks on the damp ground, like footprints that quickly blended together in the growing humidity. At 9:42 p.m., according to the kitchen clock, the internal doorbell rang by itself. It was impossible for this to happen without someone pulling the manual cord on the first floor. The cook, frightened, ran to check and found no one. Historians believe that a child may have passed by before leaving, perhaps in search of water or trying to get attention, but nothing has been proven. From this point on, the reports become more fragmented. Some versions, from employees found in shock in the following days, mention voices whispering in the hallway. However, such statements were never considered reliable, as they were given when panic had already taken hold of the community. What matters, because it is clearly and unequivocally recorded, is that in less than an hour, 41 children disappeared along paths that have not yet been accurately reconstructed. The sheriff and his team immediately searched the woods, but found only a set of footprints that diverged in 3 different directions, making it impossible to determine the exact trajectory. Some footprints were deep, others so light that they seemed to stop halfway, as if the children had dispersed or regrouped as they walked. But there is one last element from that night that marks the height of the mystery, and that ends this section with the tone of gradual tension requested by the narrator. On the floor of the dormitory, near the last row of beds, Eleanor found a single object, a small wooden button belonging to Clara's coat. The strange thing was that the button was warm, as if it had been held moments before. And according to official records, no other immediate clues were found at the school that night. It is this button, warm, out of place, silent, that becomes the last confirmed evidence before the investigation plunges into rumors, hypotheses, and contradictions. The morning after the 41 children disappeared was recorded in the archives as the day the school stopped breathing. The researcher who revisited these documents described the scene with almost painful objectivity. Staff in shock, empty corridors, beds untouched except for abandoned blankets, and a sense that something had been torn away with silent violence. Not physical, but structural. At 5:30 a.m., when the bell was supposed to announce the start of activities, nothing happened. It was the cook, Mrs. Mulligan, who first noticed that there were no footsteps coming down the stairs. The silence led her to the second floor, then to the third-floor hallway. There she found the dormitory exactly as Eleanor and Merritt had left it a few hours earlier. Windows open, mattresses dragged across the floor, blankets twisted, and no children. In a written statement, Mulligan described the scene as an absence so complete that it seemed to have weight. Historians often quote this phrase to illustrate the collective perception of the community in the days that followed. Briar Ridge was small, and having an entire institution of children disappear overnight was not just a police case, it was a profound social trauma. The local sheriff, Thomas Everdell, arrived at 7:20 a.m. His initial report describes the school as orderly, with no signs of a struggle, but profoundly wrong. He noted footprints on the lawn, but the early morning fog had already erased many of the traces. The only concrete evidence was marks leading away from the back door, but they split almost immediately, making any solid reconstruction impossible. The community reacted with a mixture of despair and guilt. Farmers left their fields to join the search. Shopkeepers closed their stores. The local pastor kept the church doors open all week, welcoming foster parents, neighbors, and residents who had never set foot in the school, but felt responsible for what had happened that night. Meanwhile, Eleanor Hartwell remained at the school, cooperating with the authorities and reliving, over and over, the moments before the disappearance. Testimony shows that she couldn't stop revisiting one specific question: why were they so calm? There was no running, no slamming doors, no screaming. It was as if the children had followed a script that everyone knew except the adults. During the search, 3 elements were considered crucial, although none of them resulted in a definitive explanation. 1. The trail of divergent footprints. The footprints, recorded by a police sketch artist, suggested 3 distinct directions. One toward the dense woods to the north, another to the old wagon road, and a third to the abandoned vineyard on Hargrove Hill. The strangest thing was that the number of footprints did not match the total number of children. Some paths had fewer marks than expected, others had overlapping marks, as if groups had joined or separated along the way. This inconsistency was never resolved. 2. The contradictory statements of the children found. The most sensitive part of these files are the accounts of 4 children who were found weeks later, exhausted, traumatized, and unable to give a coherent narrative. 3 boys were found 17 kilometers from the school, walking aimlessly along the road. The only girl rescued, an 8-year-old named Mabel, was found by a farmer hidden inside a barn, clutching a child's coat that was not hers. Their statements, recorded by doctors and social workers, contained fragments such as, "We just followed. He said it was time. We had to stay together. We couldn't go back. It was safer to keep walking." When asked who he was, they all remained silent. Documents show that experts at the time attributed this to trauma, possibly to a child leader who made decisions in the midst of panic. But the fact that the phrases were repeated, almost identically, always raised doubts among researchers. 3. The notes hidden under the mattresses. During a final sweep of the dormitory, an assistant found small pieces of folded paper with childish phrases, probably part of some game or code between the children. The phrases read, "When called, get up. Don't be alone. Look at the door. Don't say anything." They were all written in the same handwriting, but no one was ever able to identify who wrote them. As the days passed, the school was transformed into a search station. Maps covered the walls, groups of volunteers left every morning and returned at dusk, with reports that never connected. Some said they had seen isolated footprints near streams. Others found pieces of fabric that may or may not have belonged to the children. Nothing conclusive. The regional press began to treat the case as the silence of Briar Ridge. The reports emphasized that none of the employees had criminal records and that there were no signs of organized kidnapping. The hypothesis of a collective escape seemed unlikely given the children's age, but it was the only one that did not contradict the evidence. Still, nothing explained the orderly departure, the alignment of the footprints, the fact that no one had screamed. A researcher analyzing the case a century later identifies a central point that is often overlooked. The children seem to have made a decision, even if no one knew what it was. And in the absence of concrete explanations, the community began to create its own, all realistic, but laden with fear. Some residents suggested that one of the older boys might have led the group. Others believed that an employee, perhaps Merritt, had exerted an involuntary influence. Many pointed to the school's strictness as the cause. Perhaps they had tried to run away without direction, but nothing explained the precision of their movements, the calm described by the teacher, or the hidden notes. At the end of the second week, the school's board of directors was dismissed and a state investigation was opened. Eleanor left the institution and began to collaborate remotely. Her last statement, recorded in 1902, contains the most human revelation in this story, one that stands out among piles of dry documents. "I don't think they ran away from anyone. I think they were heading towards something only they understood. And I believe, with all my heart, that we, the adults, never saw the signs because we didn't want to interpret what was in front of us." This sentence concludes the emotional records of the case. But before we finish this section, one last piece of evidence needs to be mentioned, one that was only discovered decades later, when the building was partially demolished for restoration. In 1934, workers found, behind a false wall on the third floor, a small wooden circle formed by 11 buttons sewn with children's string. Each button corresponded to the type used on school coats in 1901. And in the center, attached by a darker thread, was a larger button, identical to the one Eleanor found warm that night. The discovery never led to any concrete conclusions, but it serves as the final piece of this puzzle. A hidden children's circle, built before the disappearance, whose intentions have never been deciphered. Today, more than a century after the events of 1901, the Briar Ridge Orphan School is nothing more than a partially restored structure, occasionally visited by historians and curious individuals who wish to understand what the archives alone have never been able to explain. The building, with its narrow windows and reinforced walls, has become a silent symbol, not only of a collective disappearance, but of human fragility in the face of what we cannot name. The researcher conducting this reconstruction walks slowly down the third-floor hallway, feeling the soft echo under the aged floorboards. There is no original furniture, no beds, no curtains, only emptiness. And that emptiness seems to carry traces of what once existed here. Muffled laughter, measured footsteps, silent lines, small eyes observing the world with caution. It is a place where absence is felt more than presence. The case reports are stored in metal drawers in the state archives, classified under unsolved cases. Not because of a lack of investigative effort, but because the clues never converged into a single narrative. Divergent footprints, notes with vague instructions, disconnected statements. Everything seems to point to coordinated action, but without obvious leadership. An escape, but without real direction. Fear, but without a clear source. When reviewing the personal documents of teacher Eleanor Hartwell, it becomes clear that the deepest mark left by this case is not in the physical evidence, but in the emotional atmosphere she describes. Her letters reveal the kind of anguish that one feels only when something important is before you, but you do not have sufficient language to name it. She never claimed to have understood the children's motivation, but she repeated, until her final years, that their calmness was the detail that most disturbed her. For contemporary researchers, this aspect is crucial. Children, especially in rigid environments, tend to react impulsively to sudden changes. But at Briar Ridge, the opposite is true. Organized, quiet, almost ceremonial behavior. This point is what many scholars consider the true heart of the mystery, not the disappearance itself, but the tranquility with which it occurred. Decades of theories have emerged: a planned escape by older children, collective panic following an unknown stimulus, an attempt to reunite with some outside group, or even a shared traumatic event that left no direct evidence. None of these hypotheses, however, fully stands up to scrutiny of the records. There is always a missing piece, always a lingering doubt. The researcher opens one of the last folders, the one containing the objects found during the 1934 restoration. Inside is a circle of buttons sewn together with children's string. The object, so simple and fragile, carries a symbolic power that is impossible to ignore. It is an artifact of unity. Circles are shapes that close, protect, and delimit. Buttons are pieces that fasten, hold, and keep something in place. It is a children's object, but with a clear intention, and no one knows what that intention was. Perhaps the most disturbing detail for those studying the case is precisely this: the children prepared something. They made decisions in advance. They created codes, notes, agreements, even without definitive explanations. It is clear that some kind of agreement existed between them, and that agreement, whatever it was not shared with the adults. It was a silent, childish pact, understood only by those little lives that disappeared on that cold September night. The researcher closes the folder and looks at the old dormitory, now just an empty space lit by natural light, silent as an old photograph. The walls hold no answers, only margins. And perhaps that is what makes the case so striking. The absence of conclusions turns each visitor into an interpreter, each file into a question, each silence into a possibility. In the years following the school's closure, memorialists and authorities attempted to give some public meaning to the tragedy. They planted trees in honor of the children, erected a plaque that is now worn away by rain, and wrote articles in newspapers preserving memories that were already fading from the collective imagination. But none of these attempts actually managed to close the case, because certain events, especially those involving human frailty and silent choices, remain open, like scars that never completely heal. At the end of this research, one reflection stands out. Perhaps we will never know where the children of Briar Ridge went, nor what they were looking for. Perhaps their steps were guided only by a common feeling, something that does not fit into official records. Perhaps they believed there was a safer, quieter place, more their own. Or perhaps they simply walked together because it was all they knew. The researcher steps away from the window and closes his notebook. There are no answers, just one last thought, gentle, painful, and inevitable, that hangs over the case like the fog that enveloped the school that night. Some disappearances don't ask for an explanation. They ask for silence.